The phone buzzed against the wooden surface of my desk, rattling a half-empty coffee cup. I glanced at the screen, expecting Natalie to confirm Sophie's drop-off or maybe a reminder from work. But the name flashing at me made my stomach drop. Mom. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. Not properly, anyway. A few awkward exchanges at Grandma's funeral, a few obligatory holiday texts that never felt like they meant anything. I could still picture the last time I'd stood in my childhood home, thick with grief, my mother's voice distant, my father's silence even heavier. And Rachel, always Rachel, the golden child. My hand hesitated over the phone, fingers hovering above the screen, the rational part of me screaming to let it ring out. But something in my chest twisted, curiosity, resentment, or just some stupid, lingering hope that maybe, for once, she had called for me and not because she needed something. I pressed the answer button. Hello? My voice was cautious, braced for whatever storm was waiting. Mia, my mother breathed, and for a second, I thought I heard relief in her voice. Or was it regret? No, not regret. She wasn't the kind to look back. Please, can you come over? Just like that. No small talk, no apologies for the years of distance, just a demand. I frowned. Is something wrong? A pause. Just come. It's important. I exhaled, rubbing my temple. The fact that she wasn't leading with Rachel's name was suspicious, but it didn't mean much. There was always a mess, and I had spent my whole life stepping around theirs, never being invited to clean it up. And yet, I knew I would go. Not for them, I told myself. For closure. Maybe even for proof that whatever this was, it wasn't my burden anymore. Fine, I said, already regretting it. I'll be there in an hour. Sophie was brushing out her curls when I walked into her room, her tiny fingers pulling the strands into uneven sections. She looked up with bright eyes, always curious, always trusting. Hey, baby, I said, kneeling beside her bed. I have to run an errand, so you'll be staying with Natalie for a few hours. Sophie wrinkled her nose. Is it work? No, I hesitated, not wanting to lie, but also not wanting to explain. It's something else. She studied my face, too perceptive for a 10-year-old. Something bad. I forced a smile, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. Just something old. But it won't take long. Sophie nodded, accepting my answer. Trusting me. She had no idea how much that meant, how much I wished I could have had that with my own parents. By the time I pulled into Natalie's driveway, the weight in my chest had grown heavier. I kissed Sophie's forehead, watching as she bounded toward her friend's front door, already talking about the movie they'd planned to watch. You okay? Natalie leaned against her porch railing, arms crossed. She was the kind of friend who didn't need explanations to know when something was wrong. I sighed. My mother called. Natalie's brows lifted. After 3 years? Must be serious. Or just another mess. I looked away, gripping my car keys. I don't know why I'm going. Because you're a good person, she said simply. Even when they don't deserve it. I scoffed. That's debatable. Call me if you need an escape plan. I nodded, grateful, then got back in my car. And then, with every mile, every turn, I drove toward the place I had spent years trying to forget. The house hadn't changed. Not the peeling white paint, not the cracked pavement leading to the porch, not the wind chime that used to lull me to sleep on warm summer nights. It was a relic of a life I no longer belonged to, yet my body reacted as if I did. My stomach tightened, my fingers clenched. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door swung open too quickly, and there she was. My mother. She looked older, though not just from time. There was something strained about her, something tired. But the moment she saw me, her lips pressed into that familiar tight line, as if she were bracing for an argument I hadn't even started yet. Mia. She stepped aside. Come in. I hesitated, then stepped over the threshold. The scent of old wood and lavender filled my nose, a scent that had once meant comfort, but now felt foreign. The living room was the same, faded floral couches, the same old lace curtains filtering the late afternoon sun. And then my father appeared from the hallway. He looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected me to actually come. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, something that made me feel like I was 18 again, waiting for approval I'd never get. "What's this about?" I asked, voice steady, arms crossed. My mother exhaled. "We need to talk." That was never a good sign. I lowered myself onto the couch, wary, feeling like a visitor in the home I had grown up in. Then talk. I had spent years burying the past, but memories had a way of resurfacing the moment I stepped into this house. Sitting on my parents' worn-out floral couch, I could feel it creeping in, the resentment, the hurt, the knowledge that this was never truly my home. The last time I had been here, I stood in this very living room, numb from grief, watching as my parents doted on Rachel while I grieved alone. It had always been that way. Rachel was their world, their shining star, while I had learned early on that love in this house was conditional. I crossed my arms, keeping my face neutral as my mother sat across from me. My father lingered near the hallway, arms resting at his sides, a man who had never been strong enough to speak against my mother's decisions. I wasn't here to reminisce, and I wasn't here to make small talk. "You said this was important," I reminded her, my voice calm but firm. "So talk." My mother exchanged a glance with my father, who sighed and rubbed his temples. It was a strange sight, my mother hesitating, as if unsure how to begin. That wasn't like her. She was always direct, always sharp-edged when it came to me. I braced myself for whatever favor they were about to ask. But before she could speak, my own memories took hold, carrying me back to the moment that had shattered whatever fragile connection I had left with them. I was 18. Young, hopeful, desperate for independence. I had worked so hard for my future, for my escape. I had done everything right. I sat in this very living room with my acceptance letter clutched in my hands. College had been my dream for as long as I could remember. I had spent years working toward it, pulling straight A's, earning scholarships, planning every step of my life beyond this house. And I had done it, I had gotten in. But tuition was expensive, even with scholarships. My parents had always promised me that my college fund would cover the costs. They had saved for years, setting money aside for my education. Or so I had believed. I got in, I had told them, excitement bubbling inside me. "I can start in the fall." My mother had nodded, not with pride, but with something unreadable in her gaze. My father had cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Then the words that changed everything. "Mia, about the college fund." I still remembered the way my mother's voice had trailed off, the way my stomach had twisted with dread. "What about it?" I had asked, my grip tightening around my acceptance letter. My father had looked away. My mother hadn't. She had faced me with that same detached expression she wore now. "We used it," she had said simply. I had blinked. Used it? For what? "For Rachel's wedding," she had said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She needed help, and we couldn't say no. Rachel's wedding. My future, gone in an instant. My sister had gotten the grand wedding of her dreams, while I was left with nothing. No tuition. No safety net. Just a pile of student loans I would be paying off for years. I had waited for some kind of remorse, some apology. I had waited for my father to step in, to say this wasn't right. But neither of them had. "You'll figure something out," my mother had said, dismissive. "You always do." I had left that night. I had built my life without them. I had put myself through school, worked 2 jobs, taken out loans. I had survived without their help, without their support. And yet, here I was again. I shook off the memory, returning to the present. My mother was watching me, her expression unreadable. My father shifted in his seat. "I assume this has something to do with Rachel," I said bitterly. It always did. My mother's lips thinned, and for the first time, I saw something like shame flicker in her eyes. I laughed, humorless. "Let me guess. She's in trouble, and you want me to fix it?" They didn't deny it. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. I should have known. After all these years, after everything they had done, they still expected me to be the one to clean up the mess. But the difference was, I wasn't 18 anymore. I wasn't naive. And I wasn't about to let them use me again. I stood, smoothing my hands down my jeans. "I'm not interested," I said simply. You made your choices a long time ago. You chose her, not me. My mother's face hardened. Mia, we're still your parents. Funny, I said, my voice colder than I expected. You only remember that when you need something. My father sighed heavily, but he didn't deny it. He never did. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, ready to put this all behind me. But then my mother said something that made me pause. It's about the house. I hesitated, my fingers tightening on my purse strap. She continued, softer this time. We're going to lose it. That stopped me. Not because I cared about this house, but because for the first time, I heard something real in her voice. Fear. Desperation. And I hated that a part of me still cared. I turned back slowly, meeting her gaze. Then tell me everything, I said. And I braced myself for whatever storm was coming next. The silence that followed was thick, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My mother lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting together in her lap. My father looked at me, then at the wall, as if waiting for someone else to speak for him. For a moment, I considered walking out. I had promised myself I wouldn't get dragged into their problems again, wouldn't let them pull me back into their world of choices that never seemed to include me until they needed something. But something about the way my mother had said it, we're going to lose it, kept me rooted to the spot. I exhaled slowly. What do you mean you're losing the house? My father cleared his throat, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We took out a loan, he muttered. I blinked, waiting for more, but neither of them elaborated. I crossed my arms. For what? Another long pause. My mother finally looked up, and I saw it again, that flicker of shame, the one thing I wasn't used to seeing on her face. For Rachel, she admitted. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Of course it was for Rachel. I shook my head, disbelief settling in. Let me guess, I said, voice tight. She needed money, and you just had to help, right? My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. My father shifted uncomfortably. Her husband had a business, he said, as if that excused everything. It was struggling, and she convinced us it would turn around with a little help. I almost wanted to be impressed. Rachel had been pulling this con for years, convincing people to take the fall for her, to save her from her own bad decisions. And my parents, ever devoted, had fallen for it again. How much? I asked, bracing myself. My father hesitated. A lot. I sighed sharply. Define a lot, Dad. He swallowed. 200,000. I stared at him. The number rang in my ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. My stomach twisted. 200, I cut myself off, shaking my head. Are you serious? It wasn't supposed to be this way, my mother said quickly. Rachel was making payments. I scoffed. Until she wasn't. She flinched, but didn't deny it. She stopped paying months ago, my father admitted. And now the bank is coming after us. I wanted to feel sorry for them. I really did. But all I could feel was exhaustion. This was the same cycle, the same story, just on a much bigger scale. And now, when everything was falling apart, they were here, expecting me to pick up the pieces. I leaned back, crossing my arms tightly. And what exactly do you want from me? My mother's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, she seemed hesitant. We thought. She swallowed. Maybe you could help. The words hit me like a slap. You have got to be joking, I said flatly. We wouldn't ask if we had another choice, my father said, his voice low. But we're going to lose everything, Mia. I stared at them stunned. They really thought I would do this. That I would swoop in like the daughter they had never treated as their own and save them. They thought I owed them. I laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound, one that made my mother's face darken with something close to irritation. You want me, I said slowly, to fix the mess you made for Rachel. Again. This isn't just about Rachel, my mother snapped. This is about us. This is our home, Mia. The anger bubbled up, sharp and hot in my chest. No, I shot back. It's your home. The same one you made very clear I was never really a part of. The same one you let Rachel take everything from. We are still your parents, she said, as if that meant something. I stared at her, shaking my head. when it benefits you. The words hung between us, heavy and unmovable. I thought of Sophie, of how I had worked to build a home for her, a real one, where she was loved and safe and never had to question if she mattered. And here my parents were, standing in front of me, asking me to sacrifice that for them. No, I can't help you, I said finally, standing up. I won't. Mia, my father sighed, running a hand over his face. If we lose the house, we'll have nowhere to go. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. No guilt. No obligation. Just a cold, hard truth. That's not my problem, I said, turning toward the door. My mother stood suddenly. So that's it? Her voice was sharp, the desperation now mixed with something else, anger. You're just going to walk away? I turned back slowly, meeting her eyes. Like you did when I needed you? She flinched. I let her. I didn't owe them anything. Without another word, I walked out the door, leaving them in the house they had chosen to risk for someone who would never save them. And this time, I wasn't looking back. For days, I tried to forget about that conversation. I buried myself in work, in the comforting routine of morning coffee, dropping Sophie off at school, answering emails, and checking off my never-ending to-do list. I told myself I had done the right thing by walking away, by refusing to let my parents drag me into yet another one of Rachel's messes. But their words lingered. We're going to lose everything, Mia. I hated that a part of me cared. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs while she worked on her math homework. I was across from her, flipping through a stack of work papers, but my mind was elsewhere. Mom? Sophie's voice was soft. I looked up, forcing a smile. Yeah, baby. She bit her lip. Why do you look sad? My stomach twisted. Sophie was too perceptive, too good at reading me. I sighed, setting my papers aside. I'm just thinking, that's all. About what? I hesitated. I had never hidden things from Sophie, but I didn't want to burden her with my family's problems. Still, she deserved some honesty. My parents, I admitted. They're having some trouble. Sophie frowned. Are they sick? No, I said quickly. Not sick. Just struggling. Her shoulders relaxed, but she tilted her head. Are you going to help them? The question cut through me like a blade. It was so simple, so innocent. To Sophie, family meant love. It meant showing up, being there. She had no idea that it could mean betrayal, resentment, years of being overlooked and cast aside. I don't know, I said honestly. Sophie nodded, her small fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. I think it's nice to help people, she said thoughtfully, even when they don't always deserve it. I swallowed. Out of the mouths of babes. I found myself outside my parents' house a week later, gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor me in place. I told myself I was doing this for Sophie. Not for my parents, not for Rachel. But for my daughter, who deserved to know her grandparents, who deserved to see kindness, even when it wasn't earned. Taking a deep breath, I knocked on the door. It opened faster than I expected, revealing my mother's startled face. Mia, she said, as if unsure I was really there. I exhaled. I've been thinking. I crossed my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. I still don't think you deserve my help. But I hesitated, then forced the words out. Sophie deserves to know her family. My mother's lips parted slightly, as if she wasn't sure how to respond. I'll help, I continued. But I have conditions. She blinked, and I saw the gears turning in her head, already recalculating her strategy. I'll rent out my apartment, I said, keeping my voice firm. The extra money will go toward the mortgage. In return, Sophie and I will move in. Her eyes widened. You'd. I'm not doing this to save you, I cut in. I'm doing this so Sophie has the chance to know you. But if I see any favoritism, any signs that you're putting Rachel ahead of us again, I'm done. No second chances. She opened her mouth, then closed it, nodding slowly. Understood. I didn't believe her. Not fully. But this was the best I could offer. Moving back into my childhood home was strange. The walls that had once felt like a prison now felt smaller, suffocating in a different way. But Sophie was excited, running through the house, exploring every corner like she had found a new adventure. My mother, to my surprise, took to Sophie quickly. She made breakfast in the mornings, taught her how to bake the way she had never done with me. My father taught her chess in the evenings, his voice calm, patient, so different from the man I had grown up with. I tried not to resent it. I tried to tell myself it was good, that Sophie was getting something I never had. But sometimes I would watch from the doorway, wondering why they hadn't been like this for me. And then I would remind myself it didn't matter anymore. I had done this for Sophie. Not for them. Not for Rachel. But I should have known that nothing good ever lasted. Moving back into my childhood home felt like stepping into an old, uncomfortable pair of shoes, ones that still fit, but pinched in all the places you had forgotten about. The walls held too many memories, and no matter how much I told myself that this was temporary, that I was doing this for Sophie, a part of me hated being here. But I kept my head down and focused on what mattered. I had made my decision, and now I had to live with it. The first few weeks were surprisingly smooth. My mother, who had always been distant with me, took to Sophie as if she had been waiting for a granddaughter her whole life. Mornings started with the smell of fresh pancakes and the sound of my mother teaching Sophie how to measure ingredients properly. It was strange, watching her pour affection into my daughter, giving her the kind of love I had never received. I told myself it was a good thing, that at least Sophie would have a connection with them, even if I never truly had. My father was quieter, but he showed his affection in small ways. He taught Sophie how to play chess in the evenings, his patience endless as she fumbled through strategies. I had never seen him like this before, gentle, engaged. He had never taught me how to play. I hadn't even known he liked chess. I tried not to let the bitterness creep in. I busied myself with work. After years of balancing a part-time job with raising Sophie, I had finally started to find some real stability. My recent promotion meant more travel, more hours, but it also meant a bigger paycheck. I needed that. The extra income from renting my apartment was going straight into the mortgage payments, but if I was careful, I could start saving again. It wasn't ideal, but it was a plan. And for a while, it worked, until the cracks started to show. It began with little things. I would come home from a long day to find Sophie curled up on the couch, exhausted, while my mother praised Rachel's kids for something trivial. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things. But then I started noticing the shifts. Whenever Rachel's kids visited, because of course, she still dropped them off unannounced, my mother's attention would snap to them instantly. They were lavished with praise, given the best snacks, their favorite meals. Sophie, meanwhile, was expected to go along with whatever they wanted. At first, she didn't seem to mind. She was a naturally kind child, eager to please. But then I started seeing her quiet moments, the way she would sit silently at the dinner table while my mother cooed over Rachel's son for finishing a simple homework assignment. One evening, I found Sophie helping my mother wash dishes while Rachel's kids sat on the couch, playing. "Sophie, go relax," I said, frowning. "You've had a long day." She hesitated, looking at my mother for approval before setting down the dish towel. "She offered," my mother said simply, as if that made it okay. I clenched my jaw but didn't argue. Not yet. Then, one night, I came home from a business trip to find Sophie curled up in bed, her eyes red from crying. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her hair back. "What's wrong, baby?" She sniffled. "Aunt Rachel told me I have to be more helpful." A cold, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "She said since I'm staying here, I should be useful," Sophie mumbled. "So I cleaned up after dinner. And helped with the laundry. And," she hesitated, "she said I'm lucky to have a place to stay, so I shouldn't complain." My blood turned to ice. "Rachel." I took a slow breath, forcing down the rage bubbling inside me. "You don't have to do anything for Rachel," I said firmly. "Do you understand me?" Sophie nodded, but she still looked uncertain. I kissed her forehead. "I'll handle it." The next morning, I found my mother in the kitchen, making breakfast like it was just another day. "We need to talk," I said, my voice clipped. She glanced at me, then continued flipping pancakes. "About what?" I placed my hands on the counter. Sophie is not Rachel's servant. My mother stiffened. No one said she was. Then explain why Rachel is telling my daughter she has to be useful just to live here, I snapped. She sighed, setting the spatula down. Mia, Rachel is struggling. She needs help. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. And that means Sophie has to pick up the slack? She's 10, Mom. She's part of the family, my mother said, as if that excused everything. I stared at her, my hands curling into fists. You mean like I was? For the first time, she didn't have an immediate response. I exhaled sharply. This stops now. I'm not going to let you do to Sophie what you did to me. My mother's face darkened. You're being dramatic. I scoffed. No, I'm just finally seeing things clearly. I turned on my heel, heading toward my room. I needed time to think, to figure out what came next. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't going to work. I had tried to be the bigger person. I had tried to give them a second chance. But they hadn't changed. And I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. I came home from another business trip, tired but eager to see Sophie, only to find my worst nightmare waiting for me. Rachel was back. Not just visiting, not just dropping off her kids unannounced. She had moved in. The moment I stepped through the front door, I knew something was wrong. The house felt different, crowded, suffocating. Sophie was sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched dinner. My mother hovered near the stove, stirring a pot with forced casualness, while my father sat in his chair, silent as ever. And then Rachel walked in, her 2 kids trailing behind her like royalty. Mia, she said with that familiar self-satisfied smirk, the one she always wore when she got her way. You're back. My grip tightened on the handle of my suitcase. I set it down carefully, forcing myself to breathe before I said something I couldn't take back. What are you doing here? Rachel sighed dramatically, as if I were the one being difficult. I had to leave, she said, putting a hand on her hip. Things weren't working out with Jason. Of course. Another disaster of her own making. Another mess she expected everyone else to clean up. I didn't ask why you left, I said, voice dangerously low. I asked what you're doing here. She rolled her eyes. Where else was I supposed to go? I turned to my mother, who was suddenly very focused on stirring the soup. You let her move in? I asked. She needed help, my mother said quietly. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Of course she did. Rachel huffed, crossing her arms. It's not like I want to be here, Mia. But it's just until I get back on my feet. I turned to my father. And you? I asked. You just went along with this? He rubbed his temple, avoiding my gaze. She had nowhere else. I let out a sharp breath. So that's it then? She waltzes in and takes over, like always. Rachel scoffed. Oh, please. Don't be dramatic. I turned to Sophie, who was staring down at her plate, silent. That was what made my decision. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so tightly my knuckles turned white. Listen to me very carefully, I said, voice low and controlled. I have been paying the bills in this house. I have been making sure our parents keep their home. So if you think you can just show up and expect me to take care of you, you're wrong. Rachel rolled her eyes. I don't need your money, Mia. I let out a humorless laugh. Really? Because last I checked, you weren't paying rent. You weren't paying anything. She scowled but didn't respond. I turned back to my mother. You agreed to my terms when I moved in, I reminded her. And those terms did not include Rachel living here. My mother's face tightened. Mia, I won't throw my own daughter out on the street. My stomach twisted, but I refused to let it show. But you would have let Sophie and me leave without a second thought. My mother flinched, but she didn't deny it. That was all I needed to know. I pushed away from the counter. Fine, I said. Then I'm done. Rachel's brows lifted. What does that mean? I turned to Sophie, who was still silent, her eyes big and wary. I softened my voice. Go grab your bag, baby. We're leaving. Sophie hesitated. For how long? I glanced at Rachel, then at my mother. For good. I packed quickly, my movements sharp and efficient. I had learned long ago that when it came to my family, staying meant sacrificing pieces of myself. I wasn't going to let that happen to Sophie. Sophie sat on her bed, watching me. Are you mad? She asked quietly. I sighed, kneeling beside her. Not at you, baby. Never at you. She chewed her lip. I liked it here. At first. I swallowed hard. I know. She hesitated. But I don't like how they treat you. A lump formed in my throat. I reached out, brushing a curl from her face. Me neither. She nodded as if she understood. And maybe she did. I carried our bags to the front door where my parents and Rachel were waiting. My mother's face was pinched with something that might have been regret. My father was quiet as always. Rachel just looked annoyed. You're really leaving? My mother asked. Yes, I said simply. Rachel rolled her eyes. You're being ridiculous. I turned to her, my voice even. You've taken everything from me since we were kids. And they let you. But you will not take anything from my daughter. She scoffed. Oh, please. I hope you enjoy living here, I cut in, ignoring her protests. Because you're on your own now. I turned to my parents one last time. Good luck with the house, I said. And then, without another word, I took Sophie's hand and walked out the door. For the first time in years, I felt free. I drove in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Sophie sat quietly beside me, her small fingers clutching her stuffed bunny, the same one she had since she was a baby. She hadn't said much since we left my parents' house, but I could feel her watching me, her big, thoughtful eyes taking in everything. I should have felt relieved. I had finally done what I should have done a long time ago, walked away. I had set the boundary, drawn the line, and refused to let my parents and Rachel manipulate me any longer. But the anger still sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't just about Rachel moving in. It wasn't just about my parents allowing it. It was the realization that nothing had changed. They had let me believe, for a short while, that things could be different. That I could be part of a family that cared. That Sophie could have grandparents who truly saw her, loved her. And yet, the moment Rachel showed up, everything went back to the way it had always been. I should have known better. I pulled into Natalie's driveway, exhaling slowly before turning to Sophie. We'll stay here for a few nights until I figure things out, okay? Sophie nodded but didn't look at me. Instead, she whispered, I'm sorry. I frowned. For what, baby? For wanting to stay with them, she murmured. I didn't know. My heart clenched. I reached for her hand, squeezing gently. It's not your fault, I said softly. I wanted it to work too. She finally met my eyes, and in that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected, understanding. Sophie was only 10, but she saw things clearly, in a way I never had at her age. I kissed her forehead, then climbed out of the car. Before I could even knock, Natalie was already pulling the door open. About time, she said, crossing her arms. I was about 5 minutes away from showing up with a baseball bat. Despite everything, I let out a small laugh. That bad, huh? Natalie arched a brow. Mia, I've been waiting for you to walk away from them for years. Tell me you're finally done. I glanced back at Sophie, who was rubbing her tired eyes. Yeah, I said. I'm done. Staying at Natalie's felt like a breath of fresh air. It was the first time in weeks I didn't wake up feeling like I was walking on eggshells. Sophie was happier too. She played with Natalie's kids, laughed more, slept better. It was as if a weight had been lifted off her little shoulders. But I wasn't stupid. I knew we couldn't stay here forever. I spent the next few days making arrangements. My apartment was still being rented out, so I had to figure out another living situation. The good news was that with my job and savings, I could afford something new, something just for me and Sophie. I was in the middle of browsing listings when my phone buzzed. My mother. I stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Natalie glanced over from the kitchen. Don't, she said simply. I sighed. I should at least see what she wants. Natalie rolled her eyes. Fine, but if she starts guilt-tripping you, hang up. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello? Mia. My mother's voice was tense. We need to talk. I exhaled. There's nothing left to say. Rachel's struggling, she said, as if that was somehow my problem. I laughed, shaking my head. She always is. My mother hesitated. You left so suddenly. You didn't even give us a chance to. I gave you years, I interrupted. And you threw me aside the second Rachel needed something. Again. She was quiet for a moment. You're still my daughter. No, I said softly. I was only ever your backup plan. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, hear the words she wanted to say but wouldn't. Finally, she sighed. If you leave us now, Mia, that's it. Don't expect us to come running if you need help. Something inside me snapped. I let out a cold laugh. You think I've ever been able to rely on you? Silence. Then, in the quietest voice, she murmured, You've always been so stubborn. I closed my eyes. Goodbye, Mom. And I hung up. That night, I sat on the porch with Natalie, sipping tea while the kids played inside. You okay? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. The anger was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. The sadness lingered, but it didn't feel as overwhelming. I think so, I said honestly. Natalie nudged me. So, what's next? I exhaled. I'm going to find a new place. Somewhere just for me and Sophie. She smiled. Now that is the best thing I've heard all day. I smiled back, watching as Sophie laughed inside, free and happy. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. The first real sign that something was wrong came in the form of Sophie's silence. At first, I thought she was just adjusting to all the changes. We had moved into a small but cozy 2-bedroom apartment across town, and though it wasn't as big as my parents' house, it was ours. Our space. Free of the weight of the past. But something was off. Sophie had always been bright, full of questions and laughter. She loved helping me set up our new place, picking out curtains and deciding where to put the couch. But over the next few weeks, I noticed how quiet she had become. How she hesitated before speaking. How she flinched at little things, spilled milk at breakfast, dropping a fork at dinner, as if she expected to be scolded. It took me a while to connect the dots. And when I did, my stomach turned to ice. She had learned it from them. From Rachel. From my mother. From that house, where she had been told, subtly and not so subtly, that she was supposed to serve, to take up less space, to not complain. And I hadn't seen it until now. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I noticed Sophie sitting with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her body unnaturally still. I turned to her. Hey, baby, I said gently. Everything okay? She nodded quickly. Yeah. But I knew that nod. It was the same one I had learned to give as a child. The one that meant I don't want to be a problem. I paused the movie. Sophie, I said softly, you don't have to be quiet all the time. She blinked up at me, confused. I know. But I could tell she didn't believe it. I swallowed hard, forcing back the guilt. I had thought I was doing the right thing by moving in with my parents, by giving them another chance. But in doing so, I had let Sophie get hurt. And that was something I would never forgive myself for. The next morning, I made pancakes, her favorite. I let her pour the batter, spill the flour, make a mess. I laughed when she got syrup on her face, tickled her until she shrieked with laughter. And when she looked up at me, eyes wide with something I couldn't quite name, I asked the question I had been avoiding. Did they ever make you feel like you weren't enough? Sophie hesitated. And that hesitation was my answer. I set down my fork, my heart aching. You know you never have to earn love, right? I said softly. Not from me. Not from anyone. Sophie bit her lip. But what if I'm not helpful? Oh, my sweet girl. I reached for her hand. Being helpful is nice, I said. But love isn't something you have to work for. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do things for people just to make them happy. You are already enough. She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could believe me. Then, finally, she nodded. I hoped she would carry that with her. That she would never let anyone make her feel the way my parents had made me feel. But just when I thought we were free, Rachel found a way to creep back into our lives. It started with a phone call. I didn't answer at first. I saw her name flash on the screen, felt my stomach tighten, and ignored it. Then she texted. Mom and Dad are struggling. Thought you should know. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course. Another mess she wanted me to fix. I tossed my phone onto the counter, refusing to let her drag me back in. But later that evening, as I was folding laundry, Sophie looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. Mom? Yeah, baby. Do you think Grandma misses me? I froze. Did she? Maybe. Maybe not. But did it matter? Sophie sighed. I kind of miss her. My throat tightened. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't. That my mother hadn't earned her love, that she didn't deserve to be missed. But that wasn't fair. Sophie wasn't me. She hadn't spent her life being second place. She had only ever known the parts of my mother that had been kind to her before Rachel arrived and ruined it. I forced a smile. It's okay to miss people, I said carefully, even if they weren't always good to us. Sophie nodded. Do you miss her? I hesitated, then answered honestly. Sometimes. But missing someone didn't mean I had to let them back in. The next morning, I sent Rachel a single text. Mom and Dad made their choice. Let them live with it. Then, for the first time in my life, I blocked her number. I was done. Completely, finally, done. And as I sat at the breakfast table, watching Sophie eat her pancakes with a newfound lightness in her eyes, I knew I had made the right choice. I had been gone for 3 days. Just a short business trip, nothing unusual. I had arranged for Sophie to stay with Natalie, knowing she would be safe and happy there. I had kissed her goodbye, told her I'd be back soon, and left without a second thought. I never expected to get the call. I had just landed when my phone rang. I saw Natalie's name and answered with a smile, expecting her to say that Sophie wanted to tell me something funny or that she missed me. Instead, Natalie's voice was tight, urgent. Mia, you need to get here now. The smile faded from my lips. What? What happened? There was a pause. Then, it's Sophie. She's here, but Mia, your sister, threw her out of the house. The world tilted. What? My voice came out sharp, almost a whisper. She showed up at my house crying, Natalie said, her voice shaking with anger. Rachel kicked her out. At night. Alone. She had to walk here by herself, Mia. My whole body went cold. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Where is she? She's safe, Natalie assured me. But she's scared. She didn't want to tell me everything, but Mia, she kept saying she was sorry. Like it was her fault. A sharp, violent rage burned through me, hot and uncontrollable. I'm on my way. The drive to Natalie's felt like a blur, like I was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. My mind raced with everything Sophie must have felt, how terrified she must have been, wandering the dark streets alone, feeling abandoned. And my parents had let it happen. When I pulled up, I barely remembered parking before I was running to the front door. Natalie opened it instantly, and then I saw her. Sophie, sitting on the couch, wrapped in one of Natalie's blankets, her bunny clutched to her chest. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and tear-streaked. Mom, she whispered. I dropped to my knees in front of her, pulling her into my arms. I'm here, baby, I murmured into her hair. I'm here. She let out a shaky breath, her little hands gripping me like she was afraid I'd disappear. I felt her shoulders trembling and held her tighter. It was so dark, she whispered. I didn't know where to go at first. My throat closed. I pulled back just enough to look at her face, brushing the hair from her eyes. Tell me everything. She hesitated, glancing at Natalie. Natalie sighed. I'll give you two a moment. She squeezed my shoulder before stepping into the kitchen, giving us space. I turned back to Sophie. Tell me what happened, baby. Please. She sniffled. Aunt Rachel. She said I was spoiled. That I should be grateful we had a place to stay. Her voice wobbled. She got mad because I wouldn't clean up after her kids. I told her I was tired, and her breath hitched, and I felt my stomach tighten. She told me to leave, Sophie whispered. She said if I wasn't going to help, I didn't deserve to be there. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. She made me pack my things, and then she locked the door behind me. I felt my heart shatter into a million pieces. I cupped Sophie's face gently, forcing my voice to stay steady. Did Grandma and Grandpa see? A pause. Then a nod. My breath caught. And they let her do it? Sophie hesitated before nodding again. A deep, suffocating rage filled me, hotter than anything I had ever felt before. My parents had stood there and watched. Watched as my 10-year-old daughter was thrown out onto the street like she was nothing. Like she was me. I inhaled slowly, forcing the fury down for Sophie's sake. I pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "This will never happen again." She sniffled. "Promise?" I met her eyes. "I promise." And this time I meant it. I let Sophie fall asleep in my arms, her breathing slow and steady, before carefully laying her down in Natalie's guest room. Then I walked back into the kitchen, where Natalie was waiting, arms crossed, fury written all over her face. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I grabbed my keys. "I'm getting our things." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. And Mia?" I met her gaze. "Burn that bridge to the ground." I gave a short, cold nod. "I intend to." I drove straight to my parents' house, my heart pounding with rage, grief, betrayal. When I reached the front door, I didn't bother knocking. I pushed it open, storming inside. Rachel was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her like she owned the place. My mother and father were at the dining table, looking up in surprise. "Mia," my mother started, but I didn't give her a chance. "You threw my daughter out," I said, my voice calm, too calm. "You let her walk the streets alone." My mother's expression faltered. "Mia, we..." I turned to Rachel. "You..." My voice was sharp enough to cut. "You are the worst kind of person." But I already knew that. Rachel rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. I was your last safety net," I cut in. "But you just burned it." I turned to my parents. "And you," I said, my voice trembling with disgust. "I will never forgive you for this." "Mia, we didn't." I shook my head. "No. You don't get to explain this away. You made your choice. And now, so have I." I turned, walking toward my old room. "Mia, what are you doing?" Rachel snapped. I glanced back, taking back everything I paid for. And I meant everything. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to my old room and grabbed the first thing I saw, Sophie's small suitcase, the one I had left behind when we moved in, thinking we had finally found a way to make this work. I had been wrong. I shoved it open and started stuffing it with anything that belonged to us. Clothes, books, the framed picture of me and Sophie on her first day of school, anything that reminded me that this had been a home for us, even if only for a little while. Footsteps stormed behind me. "Mia, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Rachel's voice was sharp, indignant, as if she was the one being wronged. I didn't look at her. Taking back what's mine. I grabbed my laptop, my chargers, and the stack of unopened bills with my name on them, reminders that I had been paying to keep this place afloat. Rachel scoffed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic." That did it. I spun around, my fury barely contained. "Dramatic?" My voice was dangerously low. "You kicked my daughter out onto the street like she was nothing. You let a 10-year-old fend for herself in the middle of the night. And my parents, our parents, stood there and let you." Rachel crossed her arms, unbothered. She was being a brat. "I just told her to leave for a bit to teach her a lesson. It's not like..." I saw red. "You locked the door," I hissed. "You threw out a child. And they let you." I turned to my mother, who stood at the doorway, silent. "And you," I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "You always defended her. Always made excuses. But this? This was the moment you should have done something. And you didn't." My mother's face paled. "Mia, we thought..." "No," I cut her off. "You didn't think. That's the problem." I turned back to my suitcase and zipped it up. But I wasn't done. I stalked past them, down the hall, toward the living room. I reached for the TV, the one I had bought when I moved in, yanked the cords free, and set it by the door. Rachel's eyes widened. "Oh, come on." I ignored her. I moved to the dining table, grabbing the chairs, one by one. Then the new microwave. Then the coffee maker. "What are you doing?" My father finally spoke, his voice heavy. I shot him a cold look. "Taking what I paid for." My mother gasped. Mia, don't be ridiculous. No, ridiculous was me thinking I could ever be part of this family. Rachel let out an exasperated noise. You can't just take all this. Watch me. I moved faster now, adrenaline pumping through me. I had furnished this house. I had saved this house. And now? They could see how much of it was mine. I grabbed the blender, the throw pillows, the framed artwork on the wall, the bed sheets I had bought for the guest room, the rug in the hallway. You're overreacting, Rachel snapped. I laughed bitterly. Oh, I'm just getting started. My mother put a hand to her mouth, looking at my father. Do something, she hissed. But my father just sat down heavily in his chair, rubbing his temples. For once, he looked tired. Old. Defeated. He had spent his life letting my mother control everything, letting Rachel get away with anything. And now, he was watching it all fall apart. I turned back to Rachel. You can have the house, I said, my voice shaking. But you can figure out how to keep it without me. She scoffed. Like I care. I stared at her, then shook my head. You will care when the bills start piling up. Her smirk faltered slightly. I grabbed my suitcase, the last of our things, and started toward the door. But I paused, glancing back at my mother one last time. For a second, just a second, I thought she might say something. Anything. But she didn't. So I turned away, walked out the door, and didn't look back. By the time I got back to Natalie's, my heart was still pounding, my hands still shaking. I walked inside, dropping the suitcase in the entryway, and found Sophie curled up on the couch, watching a movie. When she saw me, she sat up immediately. Mom? She asked, voice small. I knelt in front of her, cupping her face in my hands. We're done, baby, I whispered. We're never going back. Her lower lip trembled. Really? I nodded. Really? She exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath this whole time. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. Natalie walked in from the kitchen, raising an eyebrow at the pile of stuff I had brought back. So, I'm guessing it went well? I let out a short laugh. Oh yeah, I made sure they'll feel this. Natalie smirked. Good. They deserve worse. I didn't disagree. But as I held Sophie, as I listened to the sound of her steady breathing, I knew I had already won. I had taken back control. And I wasn't giving it up again. I had always imagined that when I finally walked away from my parents and Rachel, I would feel nothing but relief. That there would be some grand moment of freedom, a weight lifted from my shoulders. But as I sat in the quiet of Natalie's guest room, watching Sophie sleep, I felt something else entirely. Grief. Not for them. Not for Rachel. But for the idea of a family that had never really existed. I had spent years, my whole life, really, hoping that one day they would see me. That one day, I would be enough. And now, after everything, after they had thrown away their last chance, I had to accept the truth. They had never chosen me. They never would. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. No matter how much it hurt, I knew I had done the right thing. Not just for me, but for Sophie. Especially for Sophie. I had promised her this would never happen again, and I meant it. And that meant closing the door for good. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through apartment listings on my laptop while sipping my coffee. Natalie sat across from me, arms crossed, watching me with a knowing look. You look like someone who barely slept, she said. I sighed. Just thinking. About them? I hesitated, then nodded. Natalie shook her head. Mia, I know this isn't easy. But you did the right thing. You had to walk away. I know. I rubbed my temples. It's just. I keep wondering if they even care. If they regret anything. She snorted. They don't. I knew she was right. But it didn't make it easier. I clicked on a new listing, scanning the details. I need to find a place soon, I muttered. You know you can stay as long as you need, Natalie said. I know, I said softly. But I want a fresh start. A real one. Natalie smiled. Then let's find you the perfect place. By the end of the week, I had signed a lease. A small but bright 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. And best of all, it was far away from my parents' house. The day we moved in, I let Sophie pick out her own room. She ran through the apartment, excitement replacing the sadness I had seen in her the past few weeks. She picked the one with the biggest window, already planning how she wanted to decorate it. Watching her, I felt something shift inside me. This was home. Not the house I had grown up in. Not the place I had spent my whole life trying to belong. But this. Me and Sophie. Just us. A few days later, I got another message from Rachel. Mom and Dad lost the house. Thought you should know. I stared at the screen, my emotions strangely numb. They had lost it. The house that they had chosen to save for Rachel. The one they had put everything into while expecting me to clean up the mess. And now it was gone. I waited for the sadness to come. The guilt. The instinct to fix things. But it never did. Instead, I felt nothing. I deleted the message without replying. And then, for the first time in my life, I blocked Rachel's number. No more last chances. No more being the backup plan. I was done. That night, I sat on the couch with Sophie, eating popcorn and watching a movie. Halfway through, she turned to me. Mom? Yeah, baby. She hesitated. Are you happy? I blinked at her, caught off guard. Happy? I had spent so much time surviving, so much time fighting to be seen, that I had never really stopped to think about it. I looked around at our new home, at the little life we had built, at Sophie, safe and smiling beside me. And for the first time in a long time, I knew the answer. I smiled, pulling her close. Yeah, I said softly. I really am. Sophie grinned, leaning into me. And just like that, I knew we were going to be okay. I hadn't thought about my parents in days. It was strange, after spending so much of my life tangled in their expectations, their demands, their disappointments. But as I unpacked the last of our boxes in our new apartment, I realized how quiet my mind had been without them. No guilt. No resentment. No waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next moment of being cast aside. Just me and Sophie. Just our home. And it felt good. It had been almost 2 weeks since we moved in, and things were finally starting to feel normal. I had thrown myself into work, and Sophie had adjusted surprisingly well to her new school. She was making friends, laughing more, and most importantly, she wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. I saw it in the little things. The way she sang while brushing her hair in the morning. The way she sprawled across the couch with her books, completely at ease. She wasn't waiting for permission to exist anymore. Neither was I. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, drawing. Mom? Yeah, baby. I stirred the pasta, glancing over at her. She hesitated, chewing on her lip. Do you think Grandma and Grandpa are okay? I stiffened slightly, but kept my voice even. I don't know. She tapped her pencil against the table. Do you think they miss us? I turned off the stove and faced her fully. I think, I said carefully, they miss what I could do for them. Sophie frowned. But not us. I exhaled. Maybe in their own way. But some people only know how to love when it's easy. When it benefits them. And that's not real love. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. I think I understand. And I think she did. Because she didn't ask about them again. A few days later, I got a call from Natalie. Guess what? She said the moment I answered. What? I asked, smiling. I ran into a friend of Rachel's today, she said, her voice dripping with amusement. Apparently, your parents finally lost the house. The bank took it. I froze. I had known it was coming, I had seen it in Rachel's last message. But hearing it out loud felt different. They're staying with some cousin or something, Natalie continued. Rachel's furious, obviously. She never thought this would happen. I sat down on the couch, processing the words. The house was gone. The house my parents had sacrificed everything for. The one they had chosen to save for Rachel at my expense. And now, they had nothing. A long silence stretched between me and Natalie. You okay? She finally asked. I thought about it. Was I sad? No. Did I feel guilty? Not even a little. But was I angry? I searched for the resentment, the bitterness I had carried for years. And for the first time, it wasn't there. I let out a slow breath. "Yeah," I said. "I'm okay." Natalie exhaled. "Good. Because they don't deserve a second of your pity." I smiled. "I know. And I meant it." That night, after Sophie went to bed, I sat alone on the couch, scrolling through my phone. My fingers hovered over my mother's contact. For a split second, I considered calling, asking where they were, asking if they were okay. But then I remembered the way they had looked at me when I walked out. The way they had let Rachel throw out my daughter. The way they had only ever come to me when they needed something. I wasn't their daughter. I had never been. I was just the solution to their problems. And now I wasn't. With a deep breath, I deleted their numbers. Then I opened my voicemail and scrolled through the old messages. Some were from my mother, guilt-tripping me. Others were from my father, passive and resigned. I moved them all to a folder labeled "Never Again." Not to listen to later. Just to remind myself of the kind of love I didn't need. I locked my phone and leaned back against the couch. The silence was peaceful. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. Sophie and I sat on the balcony of our new apartment, wrapped in soft blankets as the evening air cooled. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. No more walking on eggshells. No more waiting for the next betrayal. Just me and my daughter, in a home that was truly ours. Sophie leaned against my side, her small fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." She hesitated. "Do you ever get sad about them?" I exhaled slowly, knowing exactly who she meant. My parents. Rachel. The family I had spent my whole life trying to belong to. I used to, I admitted. For a long time, I thought if I just did enough, if I was good enough, they'd love me the way I needed them to. Sophie looked up at me with wide, knowing eyes. Like how I tried to help so they would like me? A lump formed in my throat. She understood more than she should have had to. I nodded. "Yeah, baby." Just like that. She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I don't think they know how to love right." I blinked, taken aback by the simple truth of her words. She was right. Love, real love, wasn't something you had to fight for. It wasn't something you had to earn. And my parents? They had never known how to love without conditions, without expectation, without selfishness. "I think you're right," I said softly. "But that's their loss, not ours." Sophie nodded, seeming to accept that. Then she tilted her head. "Are we still a family?" I turned to her, surprised. "Of course we are." She bit her lip. "Even though it's just us?" I pulled her into my arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Especially because it's just us." She let out a little giggle, curling into my side. We sat there for a while, watching the city, letting the silence wrap around us like a promise. We didn't need them. We never had. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. For years, my parents and Rachel had been a shadow over my life, a weight I could never quite put down. But now, standing in my own kitchen, making breakfast in a home that was mine, I realized something. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. Sophie danced into the room, her curls bouncing, already chattering about her plans for the day. She had a play date later, a new friend from school. A real fresh start. As I poured her orange juice, my phone buzzed on the counter. I hesitated before looking at it, half expecting another message from Rachel, another desperate plea from my mother. But it wasn't. It was a notification from my bank. A deposit, one I had set up automatically. Sophie's college fund. I smiled to myself, a deep, satisfied kind of joy filling my chest. The money I used to spend on my parents' bills now went into Sophie's future. And this time, nobody was going to take it from her. That evening, Sophie and I made dinner together, laughing as we made a mess with the flour. She had insisted on baking cookies for dessert, and I didn't have the heart to tell her that half the batter had ended up on the floor. As we sat down to eat, Sophie looked up at me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Mom?" "Yeah, baby." She smiled. "I think we're gonna be okay." I reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "I know we are." She grinned, her eyes bright and full of trust. And for the first time in my life, I knew, really knew, that I had finally broken free. We were no longer just getting by. We were thriving. And no one could take that away from us.